Labour law expert says the workers' conduct may have shown disregard for the legal processes. They've ignored an interdict against the illegal strike at 9 power stations. To discuss this further, we're joined by Labour law specialist Andrew Levy. Andrew, thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. We're going to get into the complexities in just a moment, but I want to start off with something that seems like a very basic contradiction. So Eskom is saying that 90% of workers have been absent, they couldn't do planned maintenance, and that is the reason behind the blackouts. Unions and workers are saying that workers are not to blame and that Eskom has had historic issues and that they have absolutely nothing to do with this week's load shedding. Stuck in the middle, ordinary South Africans feel they're being held to ransom. So is one party lying? Is everybody lying? Or is the complexity of the problem such that blame cannot be dished out purely at one person's door?
Look, it is certainly a complex issue. But listening to the comments I've just heard, they are full of illogicalities, of conveniently massaging the facts to try and put a particular position. Of course, Eskom's had long-term problems, of which Labour is certainly a part. But to hear Matthew Park saying that this is not the fault of the workers have ignored the law. They have shown utter contempt for the Labour Relations Act, which the unions are all party to, and is part of the Code of Good Practice on collective bargaining. They have ignored a court interdict. Now, obviously, the unions themselves want to distance themselves from that, because if they're seen to be in support, well, they might even make themselves liable for some sort of punitive damages. But to suggest that the sudden ramping up of load shedding is not because the workers are on strike is absolutely nonsensical. Yes, we've had load shedding before, but to conveniently ignore the fact that workers are on strikes is really trying to wash your hands of the matter and not to face up to the truth. The other thing I must take issue with, and this is just one point I'm choosing, there are many points, is this idea that workers don't want to strike, they are forced to strike. This strike has taken place before the negotiations had been completed. Deadlock had not been reached. Now, good faith bargaining says you declare the dispute when neither side has any further movement. And of course, the strike takes place. It's an extension of collective bargaining. And sooner or later, one side will offer to move its position. But to say they were forced before the negotiations had really got underway is something that, if you expose it to the light of the truth, doesn't sound very convincing to me anyway.
So you're saying that workers are not only disregarding labour laws by going on an unprotected strike and ignoring a court interdict, but that they're also disregarding their own union leaders, and that fracturing within the labour movement is going to lead to much bigger problems down the road. Tell us what we're looking at.
Well, I think one's got to divide that into a number of statements. I mean, I don't know what the union leaders are telling them. And I certainly think the union leaders who claim to be a worker-driven organization, which to some extent is true, but conveniently shrugs off the union's responsibility for moderating worker demands when they are completely unattainable, and to either inform workers or not to caution workers when they say we want 12% or 30%, that settlements are not achievable at that rate. The unions know what the settlements are because they're part of them, is utterly irresponsible. So, I think that needs to be said. But yes, there is an increasing fracture. And I think that as I understand it, the intervention of the Minister, Minister Gordon, behind the scenes to move the Eskom offer from 5.5% to 7% is bad negotiation. You don't make huge moves under pressure. You make small moves and you seek something in return. All you do is, if you make a big move like that, and a 1.5% move in a wage negotiation is huge, is you invite more pressure. And my sense is that the feeling in the Mpumalanga power stations, which again reportedly are the ones where the workers are umming and ahhing about the deal, is that there will be people there, workers there, saying, well, if we went on this strike and we got an extra 1.5%, let's stay out and maybe we'll get another 1.5% or 2%. So I think the whole conduct of the negotiation is open to examination. But at the end of it, what we're looking at is a greater distancing between union leadership and between union membership. And union membership have been for a lengthy period of time, and increasingly over the last several years, been taken to more and more unlawful strikes, unprocedural strikes. The violence has been escalating, and one does not hear the unions publicly decrying this, disowning or disciplining those members, urging them publicly to go back to work. There is, one could say, a silence. And when they do speak, the union leaders are saying, well, you can't blame them and it's not their fault and they're frustrated. And this has been going on at Eskom for a long, long time. I mean, yes, it has been going on for a long time. But what has gone on at Eskom and Transnet for that matter, and SAA for that matter, is all part of the general disregard for the rule of law and respect for the law, which is something that threatens our entire democracy. And this is something I think Cheryl Carolus was talking about a little earlier on. So I think it's true to say our labour relations are dysfunctional. Our Labour Relations Act and our labour market are not only dysfunctional, they are fractured. They need rapid rejigging. But I can't see that the current government, the state president, have the courage or the strength or the confidence to do this. And of course, the impact on the country and investment is very, very negative, let alone the impact of this extent of load shedding on economic growth. And the only thing that will deal with our economic growth, with our unemployment problem, is economic growth of 5 to 6% or more for the next decade and a half. And at this point, it seems highly unlikely that that is in prospect.
Just looking at the global picture, we're seeing an increase in industrial action across the world. British telecoms, rail agencies, to name just a few. So is this violence and the lawlessness that you speak of in South African industrial action, is that unique to us, or is that something that we're seeing in other countries as well?
It's certainly not been unique to South Africa. And violence and intimidation has been a pillion passenger to industrial action for a long, over a century, in fact. One could look to the strikes at Ford's River Rouge plant in Detroit in the 30s. You could look at the miners' strike in Britain in the 80s. But certainly what has happened in the rest of the world, that the incidents of violence have decreased. You can't say that they've ended fully, but they don't end in the death of strikers as a general rule. And certainly strikers do not destroy their own factories, the source of their own income and their jobs, with the rapidity and extent with which they appear to do in South Africa. And I think that the bottom denominator, or the common denominator, is the fact that we have very little respect for the rule of law, which you could not say is the case, for example, in Great Britain. Now, what is interesting is that the current strikes in the UK, if one looks at the rail workers and other workers that are coming out, I mean, interestingly enough, the barristers, the equivalent of our advocates, are also coming out on strike. Has been the impact of COVID on jobs, on earnings due to shutdown, and of course the very rapid inflation that we're seeing, A, because of world economic situations, and B, because of the war in Ukraine. So these unquestionably impact on workers' incomes. No doubt about that. And you can't blame workers for wanting more. But certainly one can question the violent behavior. And what is ultimately sad is that there seems to be nothing, certainly in the short term, that can be done. I mean, if Eskom were, for example, to fire its entire labour force, that's no answer, because they're going to have to hire them all next week. You know, you can't go down to the local Department of Labour and pick up 17,000 workers and put them into a power station. There are training issues, there are issues of safety. They need those workers just as those workers need their employer. So there it is. Equally, our Labour Relations Act says that if you fire the workers, strikers, and then you rehire one, you have to rehire every one of them. In other words, you can't weed out the troublemakers, so to speak. That's an important point. But the most distressing part of all, which is demonstrated by these negotiations, is that when our Labour Relations Act was rewritten in 1995, the drafters took out the duty to bargain in good faith. So we have lost that. Now, we also, by the way, lost the strike ballot. And I think we are the only country, as far as I understand it, in the world that does not have some form of duty to bargain in good faith and doesn't require some form of strike ballot. Now, government has tried to reintroduce both of those, but it's backed off on the strike ballot due to incompetent drafting. And it was sort of mealy-mouthed about it in the first place anyway. And it's tried to introduce the duty to bargain in good faith via the back door, via a code of good practice. But there is no means, no teeth to enforce it. And what we've seen at Eskom is entirely bad faith. And the style of negotiation where you go in with the claim, for example, for 12%, and remember, that's just the wages. It's 12% on the premium and extra holidays and extra this, that, and the other. And frequently the claim comes to 80 or 90%. Now, that's bad faith bargaining, because when you ask the unions to, please, can you justify where these numbers come from, they get very angry. They can't, they won't. And if you say, well, can you tell us 3 other places where you have had settlements of 12%? They know they can't, because they don't. So obviously there's a degree of bluff and counter bluff in negotiations, but one must at least, if you're in good faith, be credible. And I think that if workers are told, or if workers believe, and I don't know which way this thing flows, that 12% is achievable, or that 12% is a clever negotiating position, and then a whole tranche of them become impatient and go on a wildcat strike and then intimidate others, what can one do? Short of calling in the army, which of course would be utterly disastrous, because that would require a state of martial law, and that would be, as an investment destination, an absolute titanic disaster for the country.
Andrew, such a complex issue. I wish we had more time. One quick last question for you, if you would. Keep it short. There's a lot of calls for CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, his entire EXCO, and even the board to be sacked because of this strike and the subsequent or coinciding, depending on which view you take, and support load shedding. Do you think that's in any form an answer?
Absolutely not. It's like, shooting the messengers again. I think the only hope that Eskom has is competent management. It's not going to come from anywhere else. And remember a couple of weeks ago, it was the SARS employees who were calling on Cyril Ramaphosa to intervene, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a common thing. If workers become desperate, they feel they're losing the strike, and they want to lash out. I think that is not the case at all. If anything, the previous CEOs of Eskom who have left under a cloud, they should be in court and they should face imprisonment. That's what should be done. I think one should leave in place the current team who are trying desperately to improve things.
Well, thank you so much for your insights. That was labour law specialist Andrew Levy talking to us about the ongoing Eskom wage negotiations.